this is the most primary one, that there are these universals in the human condition that are accessible through practice and that can be worked with in using practice, and that those universals offer a kind of freedom that's not particularly well defined in the context of that practical and philosophical framework, but that's usually talked about as freedom, right? And the practices that are held up, the most generic way of talking about the practices that are held up as important in that context of connecting with those universals in the human condition and working with them in such a way that you become more free from suffering, right, etc., are some kind of mindful introspection and also mindful adherence to a set of moral precepts. I would say that about sums it up. And famously in the in a bunch of early Buddhist schools, what happened was there's a marvelous document that describes the evolution of the Buddhist precepts, and it sort of starts like this. There were all these Buddhists and they were living together in the forest and they're having a marvelous time, and then it turned out somebody was embezzling money from the Sangha, and the Buddha said, "Oh my God, we have to have a meeting." So he called everybody and he said, "Could you not see that this was a bad idea?" And they kind of had an argument about it, and the Buddha said, "Okay, after this, no more embezzlement," right? And that went on for years until finally there were hundreds or even thousands of precepts to conform to, and then when Buddhism landed in China, they started sort of fiddling with that, and they decided they needed a smaller set, and they converted some of the precepts into guidelines and so on and so forth. But in any case, mostly mindful introspection and adherence to the precepts. And if you read the Pali Canon, there's this, and maybe I've already talked about this, but there's this famous like classic piece in the Digha Nikaya that's called it's named after I think it's called the Ajata Satu Sutra or something like that. It's named after this king that comes to ask the Buddha about the benefits of the contemplative life. Why are you doing this, right? And the Buddha basically holds those up. He says, you have adherence to the precepts and mindful introspection, and those taken together produce this sort of exemplary life that has all these positive characteristics. Right? And then the king goes and gets on his elephant and rides off. And that's sort of the end of the story. Although the actual end of the story is the last thing the king says to the Buddha before he rides off is he says, "Oh, and the reason I'm asking is because I've been in a state of horrible moral conflict ever since I murdered my dad and took over the kingship." And the Buddha he takes refuge and the Buddha says, "Great, admitting your faults is a wonderful thing, it'll help." And he gets on his elephant and rides away, and the Buddha there's this long pause. And the Buddha said, if he hadn't murdered his dad, he would have woken up and been an enlightened being by now. And that's the end of the story, right? So anyway, mindful introspection adherence to the precepts, and you know, and this sort of continuous practice is held up as this sort of, yeah, the sine qua non or something like that, right? So that's good. And a lot of the stuff that happens after that is related to the actual techniques of mindful introspection that various Buddhist schools have held up, right? So obviously in the Zen school, there's this particular approach to mindful introspection called Zazen, right? Which has a number of qualities to recommend it among, and some things that are a little difficult to approach, right? So I thought we might start out with some mindful introspection, and then we can talk about some other stuff and see where it goes. So let's sit for 20, 25 minutes. What do you think? So what I'd like to do is, make yourself as comfortable from the waist down as possible. So that means if you can sit in some posture that plants both your knees, then definitely do that, right? And so Seiza is good. Any number of postures that plant both your knees are good. You can, any size or style of cushion that allows that is excellent, right? If it's hard to plant both your knees, you can put things under them, right? There's a whole bunch of sort of support cushions and things like that that you might want to use. The idea is that you want to have a kind of solid tripodal base for your sitting, so that when you rock, you can feel the support on every side, right? That you can feel your contact with the ground, and the contact with the ground feels supportive and solid. So start with that, and then building on that foundation to make your spine as upright and comfortable as possible, right? And it's a funny proposition, right? So it's often when people think of making their spine upright, they think of making it rigid and sort of, there's all these metaphors in English like ramrod straight and so on and so forth. None of it is about that, right? The idea is to notice your spine's tendency and effort to curve comfortably, and to allow those curves to take their full range and shape, right? So note the way that there's often a slight incurve at your lower back that complements the slight outcurve of your stomach. The way there's an outcurve over your shoulders, and then there's your neck, and so on and so forth. And so the one way to work with that and to make that be upright is to think in terms of your head. Think about your head maybe floating towards the ceiling, and at the same time, maybe think about this space down here, your hara, in your lower abdomen. Maybe bring a little bit of attention, and maybe a tiny bit of tension there, so that part of you feels kind of solid and immovable, and your head can float up above that. Right? That sometimes works. And the overall kind of rubric for the posture is to be simultaneously energized and upright and also relaxed. And that happens mostly because you're balanced, so you can rock left and right to find your balance point, rock forward and backward to find your balance point. And also, you're holding yourself up mostly by light engagement of the really large muscles in your body and frame. So your stomach muscles aren't totally relaxed, but they're soft, right? And the same with the muscles in your lower back. The same with the muscles in your neck and the area around your chin. You can play with that. If you clamp your chin down, you can feel all this tension that arises through here, right? So notice that that's a tension you don't want, because over time that becomes uncomfortable. So to just let your chin kind of float on this platform of muscle that runs around kind of the, in your jawline, basically. If you do that, if you bring your nose right above your navel and your ears in line with your shoulders, then you'll notice that your face kind of falls into a vertical plane, and your eyes naturally sort of are somewhat downcast and open. We should probably leave them open. We've talked about this, but probably leave them open at this point just to see what that does. And then maybe from there, bring your attention to your hara, to the place in the middle of your body, kind of 1.5 to 2 inches below your navel. And we're going to do a sort of soft version of yogic ujjayi breathing. So bring a little tension to your hara, maybe to the muscles in your pelvic floor as well. And then from there, let the breath collapse out of the body. If you were to do it loud, it would sort of sound like this, right? And then when the breath has fallen all the way out of the body, wait a second. And then just when your diaphragm says so, just let it flow in. The impression is almost like the breath is collapsing out of your body into your hara and rising up out of your hara and filling your body. Obviously, it's not exactly doing that, but that's kind of what it feels like. And when the breath collapses out of the upper body, sometimes if you pay attention, you can see the way in which some of the tension and misalignment in your upper body can kind of collapse with it. So just to notice that, maybe do a concerted breath like that, somewhere between 3 and 7 times. And then relax it just a little bit more and let your breath take its natural course and depth. But keep your attention here. Don't let it lapse. And so here's what I'd like you to notice while you're doing this. This is one of those universals of the human condition. Everybody has a natural cycle of attention. And the form that that cycle of attention takes is often it plays out like this when you're sitting. There's a moment where you've just sat down, you're kind of focused on your posture, your energy is going towards, energy and attention is going towards settling that posture, noticing the position of your limbs and the feeling of the muscles that are holding up your posture. And so at that point, you're pretty present, actually. And the quality of that attention is this kind of unloaded, receptive attention. Maybe you're fiddling with your posture a little bit, but mostly it's kind of broad, receptive, unstressed. And sometime later, and it's quite often not that much later, a thought will arise that has enough juice, usually emotional juice, that it draws your attention. Right? And there's this moment of kind of erasure in which your attention transitions from this kind of broad receptive mode to a mode of rumination, self-narration, self-construction, which frankly is where we spend a lot of time, most of the time. And that transition is hard to catch, actually maybe impossible. And when you're in the middle of, when you're really deep in rumination, self-narration and so on, your awareness of the broader picture, your body, its location in the room, the position of your limbs, all that stuff that we were just talking about, it's completely obscured. Sometimes it's only partially obscured, but in any case, the center of attention is the self. This is the self in the conventional sense of self. And that goes on for a while, and then for no apparent reason, often, we're back in the mode of receptive attention. And that mode invites a connection with the sensorium, with the body, with the breath. And so it goes. That's the cycle. So we're going to sit for a bit more. What I'd like you to do is attend as carefully as you can to the exact details of your cycle of attention without judgment or any kind of instrumentality. You're not trying to fiddle with it. You're just trying to be with it as much as humanly possible, where as much as humanly possible is usually something like some of the time. And that's okay. So while we're sitting here, it's like surfing. On the moments when you land back in the mode of receptive attention, it can be useful to allow your awareness to expand, to take in both what's going on now, but maybe also what was going on just moments before. Because in that moment, everything is visible. There's no obscuration. What was happening? Was I breathing out or in? What was I thinking? Can I detect the emotional tags that were accompanying that thought? Was there a particular sensation that brought me back, or was it just mysterious? Just to notice, that's all. Nothing more. So that's good. So I guess the first order of business is, so make yourself comfortable. and the question is, do you have any questions about sitting, posture, mental mental engagement, any of the aspects of the thing that we just went through with a little bit of narration. Any questions, comments, complaints, or other things? Thoughts? Go ahead.
So I've been doing a different technique for a long time where kind of whatever's happening, you just like allow it
Mm-hmm.
to be there. And I'm noticing a shift in this way of working where I kind of feel like it's hard to describe, but I'm like trying not to have thoughts.
Mm.
Whereas the other way I've been working, they sort of like, if they come up, you just let them kind of like come through and then wisp away. And I noticed just now, I was kind of like, oh, like there was like a sense that I should be like kind of push.
Yeah. I mean, that's not at all the intention, cool. Right? Yeah. I mean, the intention is exactly to be as present and non-judgmental with your personal cycle of attention, and everybody's is different, right? As you can be, and the only caveat there is that it really is the case that those two modes of engagement, the mode of self-construction and the mode of broad receptive attention, they're not both equally visible at all times. Mm-hmm. And so that's worth noting. And over time, what happens is their mutual visibility shifts around, and that's part of the either gift or process of practice, I would say. Does that make sense? Or
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But absolutely no. That when you're thinking, right? The thing that can be hard to do is to be thinking and also to be thoroughly engaged with the body, right? For example, right? Those things, they're not mutually exclusive, but under normal circumstances, your mode of conventional cognition is so attention grabbing and involving and requires so much internal effort that it really takes up a lot of your attention, right? And that has to be okay. And none of that is bad, right? Like we live by we live as humans by our mode of conventional cognition, right? And and it does things like allow us to do future planning and use language in a sophisticated way and all the rest of that sort of thing, right? The caveat there is those things like sophisticated use of language, future planning, and are also vast, incredibly rich sociality are also sources of suffering. And so the thing that practice generally invites is studying exactly how those things work in the context of your own cycle of attention and discovering how to work with them differently. That's all. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, okay. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
So at the beginning, I was like staring a hole at one in a visual spot, and my vision started doing this like really freaky thing where it like got really dark, and then it got really fuzzy and bright, and then there was like a glowing thing, and then there was like psychedelic aftershadows on everything, and it was really engaging. And I was also like bang on, like checking if I had a thought all the time, and I would catch like them after like half a second, boom, back in it. And then I kind of got tired of being so into it, and then I just was like on pretty long arcs where I'm like thinking about work, and then thinking about 3D printing, and then back to work again, and then back to 3D printing, and then Burning Man, and then back to here for 1 second, and then boom, back to work. You know what I mean?
Totally. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
And I think this cycle is also happening on like a much larger scale, where there's like some days or weeks when I'm like really excited to meditate, and then other days, like, you know, I haven't really been able to sit down for a week just because I kind of am not interested enough in it, and I'd like to understand more about like what causes me to be more or less interested in it, because I'm a little afraid that I'll drop it by like, I feel like I kind of chase novelty, but like the sense that I'm about to like find something out, and if I kind of didn't find anything out for a couple times, I'm like,
Nice. Yeah, I mean those are all really good points. So first of all, you know what you were seeing when your visual system was kind of looking all freaky, right?
Yeah, it's like after image, right?
But that's the structure of your visual system. That thing down there that glows, that's your essential. That's where your optic nerve attaches to the back of your eye, right? And wrapped around it is this area that's kind of contrasty, and on the edge of it, there's all this stuff that out of here it becomes kind of feathery and indistinct and so on, but also still active, you know, right? And it's fascinating. You can, so when you're sitting in a monastery, you're usually staring at a white wall, right? And so it's a perfect canvas for it. Right? You can really see the whole thing. You know, like the walls are often stucco, and so you notice that there's an area about this, a stripe about this big around that thing in the middle, where you can see the contrast in the stucco so much that you can make up impressionist paintings out of it, right? And then you know, it has the rest of it has other qualities, right? So that's thing one. What that means mostly is that your eyes have settled enough. They're not saccading around and stuff like that. And so you're actually seeing something structural about your visual system, which is kind of cool. The other stuff, I think that we this cycle of attention thing, it clearly is, it's an example of a sort of semi-autonomous function, right? Like it needs to work, because if you know, like, let's say we develop this mechanism of conventional cognition and self-construction and all that sort of thing, and all of us were like, 100,000 years ago, we were all sitting around spending all day long completely tied up in imagining the future, fiddling with it, et cetera, and doing all the things we usually do in the context of conventional cognition. If we didn't just occasionally put out a little feeler and go, is there anything else going on out there? We'd all be dead, right? So there has to be this cycle, right? But it's very prone to different factors and forces, and one of them is boredom, right? And another one is our conventional thinking engine really wants to be in control. And if you're sitting there like this and you've calmed everything down, there's a sense in which your mechanism of self-construction is going, no, we should be doing this. We should be thinking about this and this and this. And it's not necessarily a struggle, but it definitely happens, right? And so it's worth noting. And then I like what you said about the longer cycle. I would just say study that because I mean, my experience with that personally is that there's a bunch of factors involved, and they're all tangled with and wedded to the major things that kind of control my life, like how much I want donuts on a particular day, or whether I'm whether I'm awake between the hours of 2:30 and 4 in the morning on a regular basis, and all the rest of the thing. They're all linked up there, right? So that's definitely worth studying. Does that help at all? Or?
I didn't understand the last part about donuts and staying up late.
Well, I mean, just basically, I have a long cycle of desire and a long cycle of kind of rest and activity, right? And those things are completely tangled up with my cycle of attention, and affect how my cycle of attention works on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and that sort of thing. So I guess that's what I mean by that. Yeah. Does that make sense? Or, yeah.
I definitely feel like I'm seeing cycles of how much I'm taking care of myself, basically.
Yeah, totally.
That's how I'm conceptualizing.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so I would just study it because that's really valuable information.
Oh, study.
Study, yeah.
So I thought you were saying steady. Like,
No. I'm saying study it. Really pay attention to it and watch how it works. Yeah.
Each time you say study, I hear steady.
No. Sorry. Yeah.
So, understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nice.
Good.
Anyone else? Go ahead.
How do you decide on like open eyes versus closed eyes?
Yeah.
In any given day?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when Eihei Dogen wrote down the instructions for Zazen in the 13th century, he said, "Keep your eyes open." So that's how I decided is that I listened to Dogen. But I would say this about that. Obviously, there are these huge populations of meditators who meditate with their eyes closed, right? And then you got the eyes open people, and they meet in dark alleys, and they they snap their fingers and fight, basically, right? But they're both fruitful courses of exploration, right? My take on the reason why Dogen says keep your eyes open is that there's a particular quality that's encouraged in sitting zazen of being continuously and non-judgmentally present for whatever is going on right now, right? And receptively, in the sense that we were just talking about. And when you open your eyes, your visual system goes, "Oh, wow, her eyes are open. I should be paying attention to what's going on out there," right? And that subtly supports this engagement with what's happening in the present moment. And then the other function of the visual system, and this is true for all the sensory modalities as well, right? The other function of the visual system, if you leave your eyes open, is that you notice there's 3 modes of engagement for the visual system. One is looking, right? Like, I'm looking at your bottle. It is green. And you can find yourself, as you were saying, looking at the structure of your eye and going, "Wow, that's really cool," right? So there's looking, and so basically what's happening there is that's the mode in which a sensation comes up, the visual sensation comes up, it registers, it jumps into your storehouse consciousness and does a pattern match, and you start having thoughts and explanations and making up stories about your visual input, right? Which is fine, but that's kind of what we do all the time. And then there's just seeing, right? And just seeing is your eyes are open, but you're not really doing so much of that. It's more like they're just open and they're bringing in light and pattern, and the engagement with memory and pattern matching is relaxed, right? And not particularly, not particularly grabby, right? And that's the kind of the receptive nature of that broad receptive attention. Yes, sometimes you'll have a visual perception and it'll say, not hole in the floor, something like that. But for the most part, it's your engagement with the sensory modality is relaxed. And then there's not seeing, which we do a lot of, and that is, your eyes are bombarded with visual stimuli and you're not seeing any of it because you're so wrapped up in thinking, right? And so to notice where you are on that, it's not really a continuum, but on that, maybe it's a two-dimensional continuum or something like that, right? To notice where you are on it is tremendously helpful, right? Because you can really track your physical and mental engagement just by paying attention to a single sensory modality. Right? So does that help? Or?
Yeah, it's helpful. I guess, is there any situation where keeping my eyes closed would be more useful for that?
Well, so it's a great question. So I would, again, study it, right? Not steady. My experience is that a different set of things happen to me when my eyes are closed, and it's okay; they're good, right? But it's just worth seeing for yourself what the differences are and what the similarities are, right? Obviously, if you're sitting and there's a lot of distracting stuff going on in your visual system, why not close your eyes, right? It's okay. And if you're and if you're sitting and you find it's difficult to keep your eyes open and it's a struggle, and then actually try closing your eyes and see what happens. Some amazing stuff happens. Like, I think I maybe told this story last time, but I was swallowed by a giant fish once while doing that, which was kind of great, right? So, I was sitting at a monastery and it was late at night and I'd been sitting all day for 7 days or something like that, and I was kind of hungry and I was way out on the extreme edge, and I was also a little sleepy, and so I let my eyes close, and all of a sudden my body was in this vast watery space, and I was sitting, and I knew I was sitting and all the rest of that story, but at the same time I was in this vast watery space, and I was sharing it with a 60-foot long steelhead, right? And he was kind of swimming around, and he came by me, and his eyes were like this big, right? And then he swam way out the other end of the space, and he turned around and he opened his mouth and he just went, and he swallowed me up. And I got such an adrenaline rush that I snapped out of it completely, and my hair was still literally standing on end 40 minutes later when I got up at the end of sitting and went back to my cabin and tried to go to sleep. Right. So, nothing wrong with that. So anyway, it's okay to close your eyes. It's worth noticing what happens when you close your eyes and when you open your eyes. That's all. Yeah. Go ahead.
When you gave us a prompt of notice the emotional tag, there was a moment where I was like, oh, the thing I was thinking about was kind of worry, which I'm guessing the root of it is some kind of suffering.
Yeah.
And then I was trying to second moment of
Yeah.
transition, and then it was like, and there was this moment of, oh, I'm worrying, and I'm also in this space with these visual cues and with people. So I was just kind of curious about, okay, like, is it trying to then hold like both things?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I think that, so that's a subtle question. Like, if I had to, like, jump right up and say what the function of the beneficial function of this practice is, it's that it becomes possible to stand next to the inner events, outer events, thoughts, emotions, etc., that legitimately cause us to suffer, right? And to stand next to them in a way that offers freedom and supports that freedom with a kind of unconditioned appreciation of everything, that rises up naturally in the midst of practice. Right? So yes, fundamentally, right? And the kind of main thing to enact in order to encourage that function of practice is that kind of noticing, appreciating, and holding in mind, right? And which includes, again, the emotional content of it, the narrative content of it, any images or other things like that go along with it, and all the rest of that sort of thing, right? Does that sort of answer your question, or?
So is the practice holding all of it?
Yeah, exactly. And like there's all this sort of stuff about, enlightenment in the Buddhist world and so on. The Zen view is that enlightenment is just a continuous practice of doing that, basically, and that the kind of gift of the continuous practice of doing that is this kind of ease and joy that arises out of practice, basically. And even in the middle of situations that are actually quite difficult, right? Anyway, that's what Dogen says, but that's also what I say.
The joy that arises.
Yeah, ease and joy. Yeah, that's what he says in it's actually translated badly, but in his meditation instructions, he says, this isn't about learning anything. This is the Dharma gate of ease and joy. That's what he says. And people tend to ignore that and say, oh, he's just making stuff up. But he means it, actually. He completely means it. It's true.
And is there something about sitting with other people?
So obviously it's possible to sit by yourself, right? And some people are pretty good at it, actually. And there are people who are sort of natural hermits and so on and so forth. But my experience with it is that it's tremendously fruitful to sit with other people, right? It feels supportive. If you go in a monastery and you got 60 people all sitting together and getting up and moving in this sort of deliberate way around the space and all that sort of thing, it's really kind of magical. It's great. So I think it's important. Go ahead.
What time of day do you find the cycle of energy most conductive to? Is there?
Well, I'll tell you the worst time of day. It's like 3:30 in the afternoon. It's so difficult. Yeah, and I think I think and I've noticed this is also true. Like I'm not doing it so much these days, but I've done a lot of really extreme long distance cycling too, and it's exactly the same thing. I can, if I start at 6 a.m, I'm cranking away and it feels really good, and then I got to eat something, and then I'm cranking away, and then sometime invariably between 2:30 and 3:30, and lasting up until about 5. I know I'm going to be miserable. Right? There's nothing I can do about it. I've tried everything. I've tried eating more. I've tried pounding down more coffee, all the rest of that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, when it starts to when night starts to fall, it's like it picks back up again, and it's actually pretty great. And you can even get yourself swallowed by a giant fish, right? But for me, that's the energy low point. And that's true. It's even like when I was working as an engineer, my probably best job, maybe not my best job, but certainly most interesting job was I was working at a big old card table in a lab with all the ugly hardware. So we were building a CAD system, right? And we had just all the gear all over the place, like cable snaking everywhere, and everybody had a station like that. We were all there working, and it was one of these jobs where essentially everybody was working 100 hours a week, right? And at around 3, I just go to sleep, and it didn't stay asleep very long. And in fact, I stayed asleep short enough that the entire rest of the crew in the lab would get up, and they would walk up, and they'd all stand around me in a circle and wait till I woke up. And then I'd wake up, and then I'd be like, whoa, because all my colleagues would be standing there watching me sleep, right? And then they would go back to their desks. And so it was incredibly dependable, and and felt at the time it felt problematic, but anyway. So yeah, it's always been like that. Why? What about you?
I've been aspirationally trying to meditate in the early morning, right after I wake up, but then I was starting to wonder if that wasn't the best time.
Well, I mean, so there's 2 aspects to that. One is if you feel fresh in the morning, if you're kind of used to it, that can be a really good time to sit. The other thing about it is that, though, sometimes you drag something along with you from the cave of sleep and bring it into your zazen, and that can be kind of weird and incongruous or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And so for years I wasn't actually sitting much in the morning. I was sitting at 5:40 in the afternoon, and that was actually pretty good. I appreciated that a lot. Since then, my schedule has shifted around to the point where I get up really early, and I usually, when I was just at Green Gulch Farm for a couple of weeks with my daughter, we were getting up at 5:15, and it felt great. But it took a while actually to feel great sitting at 5:15 in the morning. So anyway, yeah. Okay. Well. So here's what I wanted to say in addition. Right? This interesting thing happened to Buddhism, I think, over the course of its history. I mean, we're talking about the Jatasattu Sutta. The Buddha gives this, like masterful, comprehensive explanation of kind of right at the practical level how practice works, and how it's helpful and beneficial both for the practitioner and the people that the practitioner hangs out with every day, and all the rest of that sort of thing, right? It was good. It's well worth reading, right? And all the stuff about the elephants is actually good too. And in the context of the story, also, the author of the story essentially disparages a whole bunch of contemporary teachers. By like the king is like, hey, tell me somebody. I got to go see somebody. Tell me somebody that's in town that'd be great to talk to. And they suggest this one guy, and a justice says, oh, I went to see him. He was a jerk, right? And this goes on for a while, and then finally somebody says, well, the Buddha's in town, and the king goes, oh, okay, I'll go see the Buddha, right? So there's a bunch of that stuff in the story too. But in any case, it's this kind of really straightforward explanation that has a lot of kind of lists and rubrics and all the rest of that sort of thing, which is sort of, it's been a feature of Buddhism ever since the beginning. People are constantly making lists of the 5 skandhas, which are essentially the roots of our subjective experience, right? Or the 5 ranks, which are something about the relationship between this mode of broad receptive attention and the mode of everyday cognition, and how those two things relate to each other is described by a Zen ancestor named Dongshan in this thing called the 5 ranks, right? And his teacher, or somebody a few generations back in the hierarchy, had a thing that this was based on, called something like the 4 beneficial states of mind, right? So it's full of lists, and full of stories about progress and how things progress and how they don't, and all the rest of the sort of thing. And we've been doing a lot of that stuff here, right? But the flip side of it is that by the time you get Mahayana Buddhism, which developed kind of in the few centuries after the life of Buddha, and honestly nobody really knows what the Buddha said, but by a few hundred years later, there was this school of thought that developed in the following way. So there were, the largest Buddhist school at the time was called the Sarvastivadin school, and they had developed this really sophisticated explanation and kind of analysis of human subjectivity. They did a great job, actually. It's really, really good. It's never, in some ways, it's from a experiential perspective, it's never been beat, right? It's quite good. And they had this idea that this stuff was all real, and that your job as a Buddhist was to study it and experience it and essentially do science with it. And so to build a ever more comprehensive and ever more accurately true description of human subjectivity and the process of practice, right? And then there were these other schools that were like, nah, that's bullshit. It's just mind playing with mind, or none of this stuff is really real. And so, and they used to like debate each other, and there was a lot of wrangling and so on. And finally, the standard story is there's this guy named Nagarjuna who was really, really sharp and kind of intellectually gifted, and the whole story, the mythical part of the story is that he was walking along one day, and these snake gods came up to him, and they're like, "Psst, come here." And he's like, "Wait a second." And he goes along with them, and they take him to this underground cavern, and there are these texts that have been buried in this underground cavern for like 700 years or something like that. And the Nagas are like, because his name is Nagarjuna, right? So he was allied with the Nagas. And these Nagas are like, "This is the real teaching of the Buddha. You can take it now. Go." Right? And so that's the myth about Nagarjuna. But in any case, he would, leaving aside whether he was friends with snakes or not, he was a really sharp guy, and he wrote this almost impenetrable document that demonstrates, it's pretty conclusively, that if you take the basic principles inherent in Buddhism, which are essentially that everything arises together in an interconnected way, right? Then all naive realism is nonsense, because because no one can really understand how the complexity of the universe and its interconnection is so baffling that none of the concepts we can come up with our little minds are going to properly describe it, right? And none of the categories we make to describe behavior or other things like that are really all that significant. They're provisionally correct, but they're not actually correct, right? They're not, in this large sense, they're not correct. But he also says it's clearly the case that something's going on. It's not that there's nothing going on. It's just that we'll never understand it, right? And so essentially you have all these rubrics and ideas about practice and progress and all the rest of that sort of thing, and it's stacked up right next to this completely radical non-duality, right? Where we have to be willing to accept that we don't really understand anything, right? And have to be willing to experience directly, if possible, that our helplessness in the face of the ungraspable complexity of the universe, right? And so that has this kind of sobering effect, right? It's like it's perfectly okay to, as we've been doing, cook up descriptions of practice and cook up descriptions of stages and all the rest of that sort of thing. But you have to be willing to hold them lightly enough so that they don't make a mess of things. And so that's kind of the essence of Zen in particular and Mahayana Buddhism in general, is that I would say, what do you do about that? Well, okay, so practice sincerely, right? Hold your assumptions and ideas lightly enough so that you can discard them in an instant, and pay scrupulous attention to what's actually happening now and let it be itself, act accordingly, and make your best effort to do that. That's it. That's the best we can do, right, under the circumstances. And you might think, oh, well, that's really dispiriting. But in fact, what happens when you do that is, again, as I was saying earlier, this kind of unconditioned appreciation for the actual reality of the moment starts to bubble up out of nowhere and support your everyday activity, right? Which is good. It's the Dharma gate of ease and joy. So we have about 15 minutes. Any questions about that, or what do you think?
What sutta was that?
Well, okay, the sutta in the Digha Nikaya that's about the king. I think the king's name is Ajatasattu, and it's completely worth reading. It's definitely worth reading. It's very good and also kind of funny, right? But yeah, absolutely, yeah. So, and in any case, the other name for it is the fruits of the contemplative life. So if you look up the fruits of the contemplative life, that'll take you there as well.
That's the one the snakes gave you?
The snakes. Ah,
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. No, okay. That's the stuff from the Digha Nikaya. The suttas that the snakes gave Nagarjuna are like the Prajnaparamita sutras.
Oh,
like,
okay.
right. The Mahaprajnaparamita, which includes the Diamond Sutra, the Heart Sutra, and then the Avatamsaka Sutra, and all those others. They're like. Do you want to hear the whole story? So the whole story is this, right? The whole mythical story is that one day the Buddha called this vast assembly together, and they are all sitting there, and the Buddha sat down, but instead of giving a talk, he emitted this column of light out of his head, and he flew up into heaven, and he gave the talk to his mom, right? And then at the end of every day, he did this for a few weeks, and at the end of every day, he'd come down and he'd find Shariputra, and he'd say, "This is what I said today, just so you know." But Shariputra didn't remember it all that well, right? So, but that's the story, and so supposedly those are the sutras that the Nagas gave to Nagarjuna. Okay, so it's the stuff that the Buddha said to his mom in heaven.
Got it. Okay, I think I read one of those.
Nice.
I remember some of that stuff. I was at the snake guy.
Oh, is that right?
I remember
Nice.
a little bit. Yeah, I think I read the Heart Sutra.
Yeah, Heart Sutra is good. Yeah, I mean the Heart Sutra is really good. I mean, and the Heart Sutra says exactly a bunch of other stuff, but it says exactly this thing. It says, given this quality of, well, they use the word emptiness, it's usually translated as emptiness, but given this quality of emptiness, which is to say the primacy of the interdependent co-arising of all reality, none of the Buddhist truths are actually true. So given emptiness, there's no, Four Noble Truths, no Eightfold Path, no knowledge of suffering, no attainment, and then it also it keeps going. It goes, there's no eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no sight, no sound, no smell, no taste, no touch, no object of mind, no realm of sight. So they're going through the whole the Sarvastivadin analysis of human subjectivity, right? And like kicking out all the pieces of it, right? And so in the end, it says, okay, so what do you rely on? You rely on the term that's used in the Heart Sutra as Prajnaparamita, which is to say wisdom beyond wisdom. The usual interpretation of that is that it's kind of this intuitive wisdom that arises if you really allow things to be themselves and the things of the world to tell you what you should do about them on a moment-by-moment basis. That's it. Right. And that's kind of what Nagarjuna was saying, right? Well, what else? Well, it was lovely seeing you. Thank you a lot. And I guess I should ask, next time, should I bring homework? I could give you some homework right now. I would say the most fruitful thing you can do is to carefully watch, attend to, and participate in your natural cycle of attention forever.
When's it due?
Well, forever. That's the thing about Mahayana Buddhism, right? Is that all of the time scales are infinite, right? So you don't have to worry about it.
There's a trip.
it's like the vows go, you know, there's infinitely many beings, and I vow to help them all awaken. Okay. Forever, right? And then they say, you know, delusions are inexhaustible. In other words, in every moment, delusions are arising and will be that way forever and ever and ever. I vow to end all of them, right? And then they say this really interesting thing. They say, well, it's usually translated, Dharma gates are boundless, right? In other words, the gates that the kind of prompts that the world gives us, right, are boundless. But boundless isn't exactly the right word. In Chinese, if you look at it, it includes both immeasurably small and immeasurably large, right? So you know, it's everything from holding up a grain of rice between your fingers to being swallowed by a giant fish, right? And everything in between, right? And then it says, it fundamentally says, the Buddha's way is impossible, and I vow to accomplish it. Again, infinite, right? So you can keep at it, basically.
What is delusion?
Yeah, it's a great question. Delusion arises out of our limited perspective, first of all, right? Or in the sense that our information about the universe and even this place right here is incredibly incomplete, right? So it's easy to draw erroneous conclusions based on the scantiness of the information that we get. And furthermore, our usual mode of dealing with the world is we bring in this welter of sensation, right? We throw out about 90% of what we got, maybe more, 95% of it, and then we just make up a story about the rest of it. And we hammer it into a little frame and say, that's what's happening now, right? But that activity also produces, you know, kind of slipshod explanations, ignoring stuff that's actually going on, and so on and so forth. And then the last part of delusion is that we will ourselves to ignorance, that is to say, ignoring information that for some usually emotional reason we don't want to register, right? So all of those are sources of delusion, right?
So is it delusion when you make the story up of the 5% you keep, you make a story up, and that story is wrong? Is that delusion? Or is the story always wrong?
The story is always wrong.
Okay.
But yes, absolutely, that's right. You can have a story that's good enough. You can have a delusive story that's good enough to handle 99% of the cases in a particular knowledge domain, and that's great. And a lot of us are working, you know, are doing that all the time, right? That's what we're doing, right? The problem with it is that where the suffering starts to kick up is where there's a mismatch and where you respond mistakenly as a result. That's all. Right? But yes, the story is pretty. That's one of the. One of the results of the kind of the Mahayana claim about emptiness and in interdependent co-arising is that we're guaranteed to be deluded about everything, right? And nonetheless we vow to end all delusions, right?
Sorry, did you say respond inaccurately? Like, as in, because like that links back to what you said earlier about the 5, of like practice sincerely, hold assumptions like faith,
Yeah.
and then scrupulous attention, and then is it that?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah. So we're guaranteed to respond inaccurately a number of times, right? Moment by moment. And so that given that rubric, like, what would you say the best response is to responding inaccurately or inappropriately, right? What do you think?
What is inaccurate versus?
Well, okay. So that arises that there's a famous koan where somebody asked, I think it's Yun Man, who's one of the kind of great Tang Dynasty Zen masters. He says, "What's the teaching of a whole lifetime?" By which he means, what is the teaching of the Buddha's lifetime? And Yun Man says, an appropriate response, right? So the idea is that the closer you can stand to your experience and to the actual information that's coming off the world, the more likely you are to respond appropriately. But you're still going to mess it up, right? And I guess you could say accurate is a judgment, and appropriate is an actual response, right? In some ways. And so if you respond inappropriately, I guess my question for you is, what do you do then? What do you think? I'd say you fix it, right? And that requires a sufficiently deep commitment to what's happening now, to notice and not delude oneself about the inappropriateness of the response, and make a more appropriate response, right? That's the best we can do. Again, that's making our best effort.
Is there desire mixed in?
I'd be lying if I said no, right? One of the things that turns out to be true, one of the things that turns out to be a universal in the human condition is that nobody has pure motives about anything, right? And so usually everyone brings a raft of motives to their experience and to the actions that they take. Excuse me. And that's one of the reasons why it's good to keep paying attention, because it could turn out that your desire or some other emotional force skewed your perception enough so that it turned out that you made a bad judgment. That's okay. Just fix it. That's all. Yeah. And it's a difficult topic, largely because so desire is kind of a big baggy word. It covers a lot of ground, right? It covers sort of things like sincere wishes, and it covers things like imagining a future and navigating ferociously to that future, whether that future is actually particularly good or not, right? So I would say we're constantly living in this mode where we're planning, wishing, et cetera, to pay extra close attention to the things that come up in that planning process and really get a good sense of what they feel like. Do they feel what are we rewarding or supporting by acting out that particular wish, right? But it's a complicated process, right? And to notice whether a particular action kind of aligns with your deepest intention, and that's where you get back to this whole business of the precepts, right? Like you really do, when you get ordained as a priest, you swear to uphold a bunch of precepts, and it'd be easy to see them as just injunctions not to act badly, but the way they're intended is they point out about 10 ways in which people are most likely to mess things up, and they say you're probably going to try and mess things up in one of these 10 ways. So really carefully explore your relationship with this particular domain. The tendency to be violently angry, the tendency to be to abuse, to play fast and loose with the truth, and all the rest of that sort of thing, right? And so to really explore your relationship with that and see where you're likely to mess it up, basically. They're useful hints about how things go badly, basically. And that tends to be a good way of sorting out desires, wishes, etc. Right? So it's always good to remember, once you've done one of these ceremonies, it's always good to remember that you actually stood up in front of a whole bunch of people and said you weren't going to play fast and loose with the truth. Just as a reminder, right? Anyway. All right. Thanks so much.